In our first reading today, we hear the familiar story of the golden calf. Now, traditionally, this story has been taken at face value, with the assumption being the golden calf represented an Egyptian god. But modern biblical and archaeological scholars tell us that this is a later story inserted into the time of the Exodus, and that it is meant to call attention to the worship of idols in the northern kingdom. And that it was not an issue that the golden calf was a false god. Because if you pay attention, that is not quite what the text says, but rather the issue was that the golden calf portrayed the one God in a limited fashion. In the books of Chronicles, Kings, and Samuel, we hear of golden calves being cast in the northern kingdom and set up on altars in the high places as images of God. The calf was an image of prosperity, strength, and domination. And it was felt to be a good representation of the one God. But it meant that God could be controlled and contained. God became the people's, rather than the people becoming gods. God became something they created, rather than the one who created all. God called this people again and again through the scriptures. And when we read the ancient stories of other peoples throughout the world, I think we can see that God was at work calling them as well. But what made the Jewish people special was that they sometimes chose to follow God. And they chose to question God. But through questioning, they developed true relationship with God. But they also made mistakes. And the more powerful and wealthy members of the community became, the more frequently they made mistakes. They tried to fit the one God into the context of their neighbors and the idols that their neighbors worshipped. Now, the gospel today was written to be read in this tradition. It was not a repudiation of the Jewish people as a whole, but it was a rejection of the religious and political leaders who had led the people into destruction under the Roman siege and destruction of Jerusalem. For Matthew, these figures through the rebellion had disobeyed the will of God and brought down the might of Rome upon them all. The specificity of this cause and effect is lacking in the Markan version of the story. It is therefore unlikely that Jesus himself meant for this parable to be understood in this singular way. But the parable is aimed at leaders who portray themselves as God's representatives and messengers, but who lead the people astray. These figures bear a particular wrath from God. They are invited guests who ignore the invitation and who murder the messengers and who themselves are in turn killed by the king. For Matthew, then, anyone who was spared the massacre by the Romans became the guests at the wedding. For Jesus and Mark, it seems more likely it was those who were listening to Jesus's word and or seeking baptism who were in the intended audience. Regardless, those who felt and feel justified in their own actions, who see their wealth and power as God's reward for their virtuousness, skills or wisdom, or who just leave God out of the equation altogether and see such things as just what they have earned through their own cunningness, they are the ones who are cast out at the end of the story. They were invited in when the religious and political leaders failed in their duty, but they did not transform their lives. They may have been spared the destruction of Jerusalem, but they did not change as a result of that destruction. And they continued on a path of greater destruction. They were called, but they were not chosen. God offered them a path to salvation, to unconditional love and forgiveness, to being whole. And they chose not to follow it. They chose the familiar over the unknown. Like the followers of the golden calf, they chose the created over the creator. This is not a parable about us as Christians replacing Jews who came before us, but us as a whole, purported followers of the God of love, whether Jews, Christians, Muslims, or others, choosing to be transformed by that God and by that boundless love, or choosing to follow the values of this world and choosing our own destruction. Amen.